Right now, across 2 continents simultaneously, a heat emergency is unfolding that scientists are already calling one of the most dangerous sequences in recorded history. The part that should genuinely concern you is not the temperature numbers alone. It is the chain reaction, one system triggering the next. Ocean heat loading the atmosphere locking a heat dome in place, the heat dome baking the soil dry. Dry soil amplifying the next heat pulse, and running underneath all of it, a power grid on both continents being squeezed from both directions at once with no slack left anywhere in the system. Once you see how the pieces connect, you will understand why forecasters and climate scientists this week are using words like historic and unprecedented rather than their usual cautious language. And you will understand why this is not finished. Welcome to John's Global Guide. Here is the full chain reaction, laid out step by step, exactly as it is playing out right now in July 2026. Let's start with what actually happened, because the numbers are staggering and they deserve to be stated clearly without softening. Starting in late May, parts of Europe were affected by heat waves breaking records in Spain, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Ireland. The first of these, starting on May 24th, was a historic record-shattering heat wave that resulted in temperatures of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius higher than normal, causing deaths and breaking all-time records for highest May and springtime temperatures across the affected areas. 10 to 15 degrees above normal, not 2 or 3 degrees of anomalous warmth. The scale of deviation that normally makes a heat wave memorable, 10 to 15, that is not a hot spell arriving early. That is a different atmosphere behaving by different rules. In Europe, punishing temperatures pushed thermometers as high as 43, 8 degrees Celsius, which is 111 degrees Fahrenheit in France. The Met Office in the UK upgraded an extreme heat warning to red for 6 regions of England and Wales, with amber warnings in effect from Monday, as temperatures were forecast to rise above 30 degrees Celsius for several consecutive days, posing intense heat risks that could impact vulnerable people and infrastructure. June heat topped 35 degrees Celsius for 2/3 of Europe's population, 2/3 of an entire continent experiencing temperatures above 35 degrees at the same time. The geographic scale of this event is as significant as its intensity. And just as the late June heat pulse began to fade, a second dome reloaded over Western Europe in early July, pushing the Iberian Peninsula and southern France right back into the low to mid-40s, with wildfires already burning across Portugal, Spain, and into southern France, as the ground dried out even further beneath the returning heat. Greece, Romania, Portugal, Italy, and Spain saw water exploitation rates well inside the warning zone during summer. Greece at 37%, Romania at 34%, Portugal at 31%, Italy at 27%, and Spain at 26%. 5%, water systems already under stress, reservoirs already depleted, and a second heat dome arriving before the first had fully released its grip. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was living through its own version of the same emergency. A prolonged and dangerous period of extreme heat across the central and eastern U.S. exposed pressure points for power markets, with temperatures of up to 105 degrees Fahrenheit expected, and some daily, monthly, and all-time records possible. The conditions brought increased risk for heat-related illness, particularly for vulnerable populations and those without adequate cooling. Washington, D.C. saw a high of 102 degrees Fahrenheit, a new local record for the date, on Independence Day weekend, in a city that experiences heat regularly. A new all-time record for that date in a city where records have been kept for over a century. As a dangerous heat wave settled over the East and Midwest, the U.S. Department of Energy declared a grid emergency, with roughly 160 million people across 30 states under heat alerts. Energy Secretary Chris Wright called reliable power through the stretch non-negotiable. Non-negotiable. That is the language a government uses when it is genuinely concerned that the power grid is at risk of failing at scale. The number at the center of it, PJM, the nation's largest grid operator, forecast a record 166,304 megawatts of demand for Thursday, July 2nd, topping a mark that had stood since 2006, 20 years. The previous record had stood for 20 years, and it was shattered in a single afternoon by a heat dome that sat over 67 million people in 13 states simultaneously. The DOE issued emergency orders allowing PJM to force massive data centers to switch to backup generators and temporarily waive pollution limits on power plants just to keep enough electricity flowing to prevent rolling blackouts. The nights bring no relief. Lows may struggle to fall below 80 degrees in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, so neither the grid nor the people leaning on it get a real break. That sentence contains the most important single insight into why this kind of heat event is so physiologically and operationally catastrophic. It is not about the afternoon peak alone. Your body depends on the nighttime hours to shed the heat accumulated during the day. That is the biological recovery window. When your core temperature comes back down, your cardiovascular system settles, and your body resets before the next spike. When the overnight low refuses to drop below 80 degrees, that recovery window closes. The body never gets back to baseline. Each day begins already behind the previous day's starting point. The margin narrows continuously. That is who this kills, not young, healthy adults who catch a few hours of afternoon sun. It is the elderly, the very young. People with cardiovascular or respiratory conditions. People without air conditioning whose homes hold heat long after midnight, the way concrete radiates absorbed warmth for hours after sunset. And the death toll from this kind of event almost never appears cleanly in real time. It shows up weeks later in statistical analysis, excess mortality counts, comparison to baseline death rates, the careful accounting of people who died of heart attacks and strokes and kidney failure in the days after the peak rather than during it. Now here is where the story shifts from uncomfortable to genuinely important, because heat on its own is one crisis. Heat combined with a failing power grid is an entirely different category of emergency. And the mechanism that produces grid failure during a heat dome is worth understanding precisely because it does not go away when the current event ends. Here's the vicious cycle. Water pumps run on electricity. When the grid fails, the pumps stop. Without pumps, water doesn't flow. Cities and towns across Europe faced water supply disruptions precisely when demand for water, for drinking, cooling, and irrigation, was at its peak. This is the cascade that most heatwave coverage completely misses. The grid failure does not just mean your air conditioner stops running. It means hospitals lose backup power capacity. Water treatment plants lose pumping pressure. Traffic signals go dark. Refrigeration fails in food storage and pharmaceutical supply chains. A grid emergency during extreme heat is not a single system failure. It is the triggering of every downstream system that depends on electricity simultaneously. During the European heat wave, daily power demand spiked by as much as 14% in some countries, and combined with thermal power plants struggling in the extreme heat, average daily electricity prices surged 2 to 3 times higher than normal. Greece experienced the largest jump in electricity demand during extreme heat of any country studied, with consumption rising nearly 39% above normal during the hottest periods. France alone saw evening electricity demand spike 25% above its off-season average, driven almost entirely by cooling needs, a 39% demand increase in a single country during a heat event. That is not a stress test that any grid was designed to pass with margin to spare. It is the kind of load surge that exposes every deferred maintenance decision, every aging transformer, every transmission line already running near capacity before the heat arrived. Figures suggest Europe could be at risk of losing up to 7% of its collective GDP in the next 4 years due to heat-related losses. 7% of GDP from heat alone. Not from hurricanes, not from floods, from heat events of the kind that are now happening annually across the continent. That economic figure reflects damage to agricultural systems, productivity losses, infrastructure repair, healthcare costs, and the compounding cost of a power grid that was designed for a climate that no longer exists. Now, here is the actual chain reaction, laid out step by step, because understanding the sequence is exactly what lets you see what is coming next, instead of being caught unprepared. It starts with record ocean temperatures, driven partly by a strengthening El Niño and partly by decades of accumulated background warming, which pump extra moisture and energy into the atmosphere. That extra energy helps lock a slow-moving jet stream into rigid, wavy patterns that don't shift for days or weeks at a time. Exactly the conditions that allow a heat dome to form and simply refuse to move. This blocking pattern, which meteorologists call an omega block because the pressure pattern resembles the Greek letter, prevents cooler, moisture-bearing air from the Atlantic from pushing through. The same overheated air mass sits and bakes in place day after day instead of being flushed out the way a normal weather system moves through in 48 hours. Record-breaking heat waves are even stunning scientists monitoring the acceleration of climate change. One of the most dramatic spikes came in 2023. The monthly average temperature worldwide overshot the previous September record by 0.5 degrees Celsius, the biggest such margin ever, and extreme even for an El Niño year. Scientists are still puzzling over that anomaly, going through several possible causes: water vapor from a 2022 volcanic eruption, a drop in atmosphere cooling air pollution from the shipping industry, declining cloud cover, natural climate variability. None of these factors could explain all of the surge. Scientists cannot fully explain why temperatures are spiking as dramatically as they are. That honest admission is itself one of the most significant statements in climate science right now. The models are being run with known inputs, and the outputs are still exceeding expectations. The system is behaving more extremely than the best available models predicted. The heat dome then bakes the ground beneath it, drying out soil that was already parched from a record dry spring, and dry soil loses its natural ability to cool itself through evaporation. Evaporation is essentially nature's built-in air conditioning. When there is no moisture left in the soil or the vegetation to evaporate, All of the sun's energy that would have gone into that process instead goes directly into heating the air above it. This is the feedback loop that makes successive heat waves in the same summer progressively more extreme. Dry ground makes the heat worse. The heat bakes even more moisture out of the already depleted soil. The next heat pulse then arrives at an even more vulnerable baseline. Each wave is building on the weakened foundation left by the previous one. Climate change has been cited as a contributing factor to the earlier onset of summer. Earlier onset of summer means more total days of heat, stress on soil and vegetation before the most intense heat arrives, more total days of depleted moisture, more days of accumulated heat, stress on infrastructure. The season of danger is literally getting longer. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus called heat stress the silent killer and warned that European homes, workplaces, and schools were not built for these temperatures. Not built for these temperatures. That phrase describes something that is both a present crisis and a long-term infrastructure challenge simultaneously. The building stock of Europe and significant portions of North America was designed, financed, and constructed under assumptions about what summer temperatures would look like that are no longer accurate. The physical structures where people live, work, and send their children to school are increasingly mismatched to the climate they are sitting in. Retrofitting that infrastructure is a generational project. The heat events are arriving on a 2-week cycle. Here is what genuinely concerns the scientists watching this pattern develop in real time. This entire sequence, record ocean heat, a locked jet stream, a stubborn heat dome, drying soil, and a strained power grid, is not a random, isolated occurrence. It is the exact combination that climate researchers have been modeling and warning about for years as global temperatures climb. And 2026 is already on pace to rank among the hottest years ever recorded, with the underlying El Niño continuing to strengthen. Each fraction of a degree of background warming does not just nudge the numbers upward gradually. It makes the extreme peaks of any given heat dome measurably higher and pushes what used to be considered impossible temperature records within reach. The soil across large parts of Western Europe was already exceptionally dry. Heading into this summer, following a record dry spring that gave the ground no chance to recover moisture before the first major heat pulse arrived in late May. That meant every heat wave that followed built on an already weakened foundation with less natural cooling capacity available to soften each successive blow. Combined with a power grid on both continents already running near its ceiling because of data center growth and electrification, and you have a system with almost no slack left anywhere. The next major heat dome, whenever it arrives, will be starting from an even more fragile baseline than the current event did. There is one more layer to this story that deserves direct attention. The practical impact on transportation and daily life during the current U.S. event was significant and documented. Rail authorities warned of the potential for delays through the weekend. Amtrak said trains may need to operate at reduced speeds and could experience delays between the hours of 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. due to the forecasted extreme temperatures in the Northeast, Southeast, and Midwest. New Jersey transit trains into New York were also expected to face delays and cancellations due to the heat-related impact on equipment. Train rails warp under sustained extreme heat, requiring speed reductions to prevent derailment risk. This is what climate-altered infrastructure looks like at the operational level. A heat dome does not just threaten human health. It degrades the physical performance of every piece of metal infrastructure that was engineered to tolerate temperatures within a range that this summer is repeatedly exceeding. So what actually happens next? Forecasters. Tracking the patterns say the underlying ridge responsible for these repeated heat pulses has shown no sign of permanently breaking down. Additional reloading heat domes remain a real possibility through the rest of this summer, particularly across Western and Central Europe and the Central and Eastern United States. Grid operators on both continents are already warning that any additional extreme heat event this season could push demand even further past the records that were just broken weeks ago. And each new record leaves a thinner safety margin than the one before it. The practical takeaway is not panic. It is preparation grounded in what the data is now clearly showing about how these systems interact with each other. The uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this is that what happened this summer was not a freak occurrence or a strange coincidence of bad luck. It was multiple well-understood systems, ocean heat, atmospheric circulation, soil moisture, and electrical infrastructure, all interacting in exactly the way climate scientists have been modeling and warning about for years, just playing out in real time on a scale that most people alive today have never personally witnessed. The heat wave comes as scientists warn that climate change is exacerbating the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. The burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas is the chief driver of the climate crisis. Understanding that chain, rather than treating each heat wave as an isolated surprise, is exactly what will determine how prepared we are when the same ingredients start lining up again. And based on everything the data is currently showing on July 19th, 2026, that next alignment may not be very far away at all. The grid held this time, The records broke, but the lights mostly stayed on. The question that every grid operator, every public health official, and every infrastructure planner is now sitting with is a simple one. What happens when the next dome is slightly more intense? When it arrives on ground that is even drier? When it hits a grid that has already used its emergency reserves? That question does not have a comfortable answer yet, but it is the right question to be asking right now, before the next event makes the asking irrelevant.